Now, from Wish TV, your local news source, this is All Indiana Politics.
And good morning. Welcome to another edition of All Indiana Politics. We start with the fight in Congress over a key part of President Biden's agenda. Top congressional Democrats say they've reached a framework with the White House on tax options to pay for the president's $3.5 trillion spending plan. The plan includes a number of social and environmental initiatives. Very few details of the tax plan have been released. Meanwhile, Indiana's two Republican senators say they will not vote to raise the U.S. debt ceiling. It's part of a bill to fund government operations beyond this coming Thursday. And let's welcome in Indiana Senator Mike Braun. Senator, good to see you. Thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Let's start by talking about the debt ceiling and government funding, if you don't mind. You're a hard no about raising the debt ceiling. Why?
Well, I'm generally a guy that votes on principle. Even if I like the policy, I'll generally vote against it. I've been here 2.5 years. We were 18 trillion when I got here. We're now 28 trillion in debt. This is going to add and ask for a debt ceiling to be increased by 4 to 5 trillion on the most recent spending, including the 2 trillion that we spent on the rescue plan that didn't get a Republican vote. And that's government in overdrive. I want to be clear, Republicans have been just as guilty as Democrats on how we got to this point. But the most recent kind of dereliction of duty and borrowing the money mostly from our kids and grandkids, figuratively speaking, this is beyond the pale. So in this case, you do not need one Republican to actually lift the debt ceiling, to suspend it. Democrats got that fully within their power. And in the recent past, that's generally occurred under divided government, where both needed to do it and both were complicit and guilty of where we arrived to do it. We cannot, as Republicans, if we want to still call ourselves fiscal conservatives, raise the debt ceiling for this $3.5 trillion soft infrastructure bill, $1.2 trillion hard, and the $2 trillion that we've already got in place through the Rescue Act.
Fair enough. Are you also worried about potential economic fallout of a U.S. government default on loans as well?
That is not going to happen unless the Democrats refuse to lift it within their own prerogative to do so. And again, the big difference in the past is both parties have had a stake in the game to do it. This is different this time. And to be honest, when I look at what many viewers throughout Indiana, they're looking at this, they know it generally gets worked out. It generally impacts government employees more than anybody else. They're scratching their heads about what's going on in the southern border and maybe what recently happened in Afghanistan. They're not quite as focused on the budget issues yet. And the Dems know that. This is kind of maybe trying to deflect it. They also know they got full capability to avoid a fiasco themselves.
Since you brought up the border, why don't we talk about that a little bit? Your thoughts on what's going on down there, specifically, I should say, that image that was released yesterday, earlier this week, of that Border Patrol agent on the horse using a rein on one of the migrants.
First of all, anyone that would risk their life making those kinds of journeys, you can't dismiss those underlying conditions. On the other hand, when you got a border that has now been declared open, come on through, 19 senators, myself included, in March went down there, and it had risen to 75,000 illegal crossings. You had coyotes and smugglers heckling us and the Border Patrol close to midnight down there. Never imagined we'd be over 200,000. And in that prior quarter, 54 different nationalities have come across. That can't be the way we manage our border. And until we secure it, it's going to be difficult looking at all the underlying issues of immigration reform. So it was working. It was an unforced error. I know they didn't like the wall. The Border Patrol said it was the most important thing for them to use their resources to manage it and stay in Mexico. They shouldn't have changed it just because Trump did it. That doesn't mean that was a solution. They've just made it 3 to 4 times worse.
And your thoughts again on that one picture that, as I mentioned, pretty controversial. A lot of people are talking about it.
I think any of those vivid scenes where that When we were down there, there was a body that was floating on the river that tried to cross as senators went up for 15 minutes. You're getting all of those kinds of, tears at your heart that people would do that, have the need to do it. But a lot of that's dictated by policies that we need to have in place to regulate the flow, and you wouldn't have that. So there's no way that you can say any of that is okay or isn't hard to look at, but we weren't having those kinds of issues so often, so graphically, so broadly before Biden said, hey, come on through. We're gonna get rid of the policies that were working prior.
I want to turn back now to the budget, if you don't mind, and I apologize for bouncing around. You went there with the border, and I wanted to talk about it a little bit. Reconciliation, the bill the Democrats are pushing, is this a waste of time, or does it stand a chance of getting passed?
I think it is in a way, because I don't even think they have their own party on board. And then when you look at all the complications of how we're basically borrowing the money to do it, talking about raising revenue, they know that most of their tax proposals are fraught with political issues that probably won't get to the finish line. And again, trying to call it infrastructure. I'm not saying those issues shouldn't be discussed. Should be through regular order, committees, bring in witnesses. So we do it the way you do it in all other forms of government, not in a massive reconciliation bill that won't get one Republican vote for it. And not to mention that there's probably several in their own party that won't go for it.
You know what Democrats are going to say. They're going to say that you being against this is also you being against new jobs and fighting climate change. How do you respond to that?
That would be a false argument. I've been a Republican that from the get-go has been different than many. I acknowledge that the high cost of health care is still the biggest issue here in this government. I've done more about it than any senator in my own business prior to getting here. Been the most outspoken senator on reforming it. Climate, been the first to talk about it, but not through borrowing trillions of dollars and getting something equivalent to what Obamacare was. Big health insurance, big government. Maybe had a reason to do it, but was doomed to fail. So I'm not a Republican that says we're the party of no or not interested. We need to be engaged in those issues, including climate, but not where we're crafting solutions that borrows from our kids and grandkids and adds to debt now that is higher than when it was coming out of World War II, when we were savers and investors and we're consumers and spenders now.
I have one more question for you before I let you go. It appears that a bill on police reform, it had bipartisan support. It appears it's going to go nowhere now. Did it go too far? What was the problem with that bill?
That issue was hot over a year ago, and clearly after that was reaching a level of where it looked like the Democrats were going to run with something or agree to it. That fell apart because my research of that issue is that big cities ought to be looking at their own issues where most of these problems occur, and that probably state and local governments ought to do any reform when it comes to police reform, just like we did in Indiana. That's probably something the feds need to stay out of. It got real close to something boiling over to where I think it would have hurt law enforcement. Thank goodness that didn't happen. I think all states ought to look at things that made common sense that law enforcement actually embraced and endorsed in Indiana, not this craziness of talking about defunding the police and then doing things that would hurt getting people to come in to police forces and other agencies like that. So that, I think, is an issue that is no longer going to be considered at the federal level.
Senator Mike Braun, always good to see you. Thank you for joining the program.
My pleasure.
Meanwhile, on the issue of the southern border, one more thing that we want to share with you. President Biden talked about that video that has created so much controversy.
It's outrageous. I promise you those people will pay. They will be, there's an investigation underway now, and there will be consequences. There will be consequences. It's an embarrassment, but it's beyond an embarrassment. It's dangerous. It's wrong. It sends the wrong message around the world. It sends the wrong message at home. It's simply not who we are.
All right, coming up, politics and the COVID-19 vaccines. The turbulent 24 hours on booster shots and what our medical expert and former Surgeon General, Dr. Jerome Adams, says about how political beliefs have infected the vaccine debate. That's next here on Wish TV. Welcome back to All Indiana Politics and the surprising series of events on COVID-19 vaccine booster shots to end the week. Early Friday morning, the director of the CDC approved Pfizer's request to provide COVID vaccine boosters. The shots will be for the elderly, those with underlying health problems, and for frontline workers who may have been exposed to the virus. That last category, though, is the one that caught our attention. It specifically overruled a recommendation made just hours earlier by a panel of CDC advisors. But it matched an earlier approval by the FDA, leading to criticism of dysfunction in the vaccine approval process.
Perhaps we should have brought these two agencies together and reimagined a different kind of process where they work together from the outset to come up with unified recommendations. And I think as we go forward and plan differently for a pandemic, we might think differently about how we deploy a vaccine in the setting of a public health emergency like this.
So with that confusion surrounding the votes in D.C., I asked Wish TV medical expert and former Surgeon General, Dr. Jerome Adams, if this is typical of the medical approval process.
First of all, it is important to know that the process is playing out the way it normally does with the FDA and then the CDC weighing in. That said, there is an unprecedented level of scrutiny and unprecedented level of expectation on the part of the public and an unprecedented level of politics being injected into this. And so what I would say as a doctor to our viewers out there is the process is working the way it is supposed to. And if you have questions or concerns, please always talk to your doctor or healthcare provider, but know that for a lot of people out there, you will be able to get a booster soon. Another important point, Phil, the vaccines still work incredibly well in everyone to prevent hospitalization and death. So that if you don't fall into one of those categories where you're eligible for a booster, know that you still have a lot of significant protection from your vaccination.
Meanwhile, Indiana has already announced that it will immediately offer the Pfizer boosters statewide. We want to make it easy for you to get the information about the shots. So take out your phone right now and scan the QR code on your screen. You see it there on the top right-hand side. It will take you to our As Seen on Wish TV section. There we have details on where Indiana is offering booster shots and to see if you're eligible. There's also a link to sign up for the vaccine.
Take All Indiana Politics on the go with you. Download our podcast now. Part of the All Indiana Podcast Network and allindianapodcastnetwork.com.
And welcome back to All Indiana Politics as we welcome back Tom John, former Marion County Republican Party chairman, and Kip Tu, former chairman of the Indiana Democratic Party. Gentlemen, good to see you. Let's start with that fight in Congress that we talked about at the top of the show. Senators Todd Young and Mike Braun say they will vote against the government funding, as you guys very well know, and raising the debt ceiling. Kip, I'll start with you here. Is this a dangerous game for Republicans, setting up potential shutdowns and defaults?
Yes, and it only happens when there's a Democratic president that somehow they get religion about the debt ceiling being a problem. They didn't have any problem raising it during the Trump administration, but suddenly now we have a Democratic president, and they're playing games with it again. And I don't need to say anything more than what local columnist James Briggs said. He said Todd Young and Mike Braun are acting like children over the debt ceiling. I commend his column to all of your watchers.
Tom, your response to that?
Well, I mean, the simple fact of the matter is it's a blank check. That's what we're talking about that's being debated. And they're calling to question the amount of spending that has been done without any Republican input in the last year and what is being planned to be done in the upcoming year. And this would be a blank check through the rest of the Democrat administration through the end of 2022. And they're calling into concern real legitimate issues with regard to, can we do this? How long is this sustainable? That we have reached debt ceilings that are or debt limits and debt amounts that are unprecedented for our country. And they're calling that into questions. And they're saying, if you don't want to talk to us, with regard to how this money's spent, why in the world should we actually be the ones that are giving you the blank check then? Write your own check. You're able to do it.
Let me push back on you a little bit here, Tom, because to Kip's point, there wasn't a problem the last 4 years. I mean, you heard Mike Braun say it in our interview that we just had. I mean, he basically said the same thing. So do Republicans share some of the blame here?
Certainly they do. And this goes back to something I've said here before. I mean, this is the exact outcome of the inability of the two parties to speak and work together and negotiate. And they've been unable to do that, frankly, since probably 2008, if we're really honest about it. And we need to find a path back to where we can have discussions. But certainly this order of brinksmanship from the Democrat side isn't helpful right now. And, you know, it would be great to see them come together and have a real discussion about how do we find a reasonable path forward.
Well, let's start with the president's spending plan, if you gentlemen don't mind. Democrats say they've reached an agreement among themselves, as you guys very well know, to pay for it, but we haven't seen specifics. Kip, will there be enough Democrats to approve this?
Yeah, I believe in the end that there will be. And I think that the infrastructure plan in particular is absolutely critical for the future of our country. And I'd like to hear from Republicans what part of that isn't necessary. You know, they want to complain, they don't want to vote for it. But everything in there is a critical, overdue need in the United States, and we need to fund it. And you know, I like Tom John's approach of saying we need to come together and we need to talk and we need to try to find common ground. But the unfortunate fact remains that Mitch McConnell has consistently not been willing to do that. And it's just their Dr. Nose up there. They want to see Joe Biden fail. They want Congress to fail because they think it's in their political interest that they fail. And so you can't negotiate with someone who won't negotiate.
Is that the reason, Tom, because they want to see the president fail, that they're not voting for it?
I don't think that's the reason now. And, you know, you get into this situation. One of the funny things is Kip mentioned the infrastructure bill. Which infrastructure bill? Are we talking about the hard infrastructure bill that really is about bridges and roads and deferred maintenance and protecting communities from floods and fires? Or are we talking about the so-called infrastructure bill that's about an expansion of public support programs and other programs that may or may not be needed, but as Senator Braun's mentioned, like, aren't things that should just be passed without any comment from the other side, but are being shoved through on this? And that's the gamesmanship, once again, that we have here, is we simply have no real discussion of what is necessary now. And part of this is illustrated by the split in the Democrat Party, where they have their progressives are saying that they will vote against the hard infrastructure bill. And all of these things that, to Kip's point, are absolutely needed if they don't get their wish list along with it.
Kip, I'll let you respond. Go ahead.
Well, I think the disagreement inside the Democratic Party proves the opposite point than what Tom is trying to point out, and that is that we're being reasonable. We're negotiating with each other, trying to get to a deal. And Republicans just don't want to be at the table. Joe Manchin is basically substituting for the Republican Party here because he's the one that's conservative and he doesn't want to spend as much money. And he's actually in the room negotiating because they know he'll be reasonable and try to get to a deal. Republicans won't be reasonable. That's why they're not at the table.
Tom,
but they were
quickly,
at the table
30
in the
seconds.
earlier hard infrastructure.
Will this hurt Republicans in 2022, Tom?
I think it's too early to tell. Quite frankly, these need to play out, and I think there's a real question as to telling the stories as to what the position is as far as some sort of government restraint and negotiation versus unfettered government growth, and what does the population want.
Gentlemen, we are out of time. Always good to see you.
that-
Have a great rest of your weekend. We'll be right back. And thank you for joining us for All Indiana Politics. We'll be back here next Sunday morning, 9:30. You can also find our brand new All Indiana Politics podcast. It's part of the All Indiana Podcast Network at wishtv.com. A lot of movement going on in politics this week. We'll have you covered right here on Wish TV. Have a great rest of your weekend.